Welcome back to our third session on, what title did I put on this? Yeah, Hubert Howe Bancroft and Historiography. It's again a sort of a portmanteau. To moderate it, we have Richard White, who is the Margaret Byrne Professor of History and the Director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West at Stanford, and also a recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship. I'm going to just simply turn this over to Richard.
I'm going to give a very brief introduction because we have an hour and a half, and you don't want to hear me talk about them. You want to hear them talk. We have a very distinguished panel today, and I'm just going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to present. So I'll introduce everybody, and we'll just continue on. As one person finishes, the other will come up. The first presenter is going to be Thomas G. Andrews of the University of Colorado at Denver, talking about toward an environmental history of Bancroft's works. Thomas Andrews is best known for his book, Killing for Coal, which got him off to a modest start as a historian. It won the Bancroft Prize. This isn't Hubert Howe Bancroft. This is the other Bancroft, the East Coast Bancroft. Are they actually related? Well, I've learned something today. And also the George Perkins Marsh Prize from the Environmental History Association. And the compelling thing about Thomas's work, it's really one of the few works that bring together labor history and environmental history. I'd also like to introduce Albert Hurtado, who's the Paul H. and Doris Eaton Travis Chair in Modern American History at the University of Oklahoma. I'm not going to list all his prizes. I'll just mention that he is a Ray Billington Prize winner for his book, Indian Survival on the California Frontier. And that has been one of a couple of books, which I think are some of the best books ever written on California. And they include also his Intimate Frontiers, Sex, Gender, and Culture in Early California. Al's going to be talking about a project he's underway for a long time on Herbert Bolton, which I think is almost near completion, which should be out very soon. Well, I'm sorry I said that. Okay, and the final presenter is going to be Alan Taylor, who's professor at UC Davis. Alan, of course, is best known for his Williams Cooperstown, Power and Persuasion on the Frontier of the Early American Republic, which won the Pulitzer Prize. But really, over the last 20 years, Alan has compiled a body of work which has remade the way that we think about not only the ways that Indians and whites interact in North America, but really the nature of empire, the nature of republics. It's been one of the most impressive bodies of work put together by any historian. And he is also an associate editor, I think, of the New Republic, but that doesn't mean anything. What really matters is that he writes some of the best and most compelling essays on recent American history, not recent American history, but on works recently published in American history, and is probably, I would say, the best and most prolific of book reviewers of historical works on colonial and early national period. So that's all I'm going to say about any of them. They can go on and talk from here. Thomas.
All right, good morning. Good morning. I want to thank everyone involved with organizing this, and I was very gratified to be invited to present. You know you're still early in your career when you eagerly respond to an invitation for an anniversary symposium celebrating a great historical library by proposing to write a paper on the illustrious creator of said library. Earnest enthusiasm, an act of utter foolishness, I'm not really sure, because I really didn't know anything at all about Hubert Howe Bancroft when I offered to write this paper. So here we go. This is going to be kind of I guess a sort of playful, somewhat half-baked paper, I think, ultimately. I shouldn't oversell it, though. I'm not sure how playful it actually is. But anyway, in a classic 1983 essay, What is the History of Books?, Robert Darnton urged scholars to track the, quote, communications circuit, which runs from the author to the publisher, if the bookseller does not assume that role, to the printer, the shipper, the bookseller, and the reader. Around the same time Darnton's essay appeared, environmental historians led by Richard White, William Cronin and others burst onto the scene with an exciting body of scholarship devoted to tracing the commodity chains by which lumber, grain, meat, and other products were extracted, transported, reconfigured, exchanged, consumed, and cast away. Thus, at virtually the same moment when environmental historians were placing modes of production at the center of their project, while asserting what we might call a natural theory of value in capitalist economies, book historians were making great contributions premised upon the simple but profound insight that books are more than texts as generally understood. They are also things. It's easy in retrospect to glimpse here a road not taken. Alas, books hardly counted among the list of commodities environmental historians cared about, probably because books as material objects hardly seem to hold the key to better understanding the world's ecological woes. Meanwhile, note how Darnton defined book history as a field that concerned each phase of the communication circuit and the process as a whole in all its variations over space and time, and in all its relations with other systems, economic, social, political, and cultural, in the surrounding environment. To Darnton, environment figured only in its most generic sense. Ecological systems, meanwhile, played no role in the model Darnton proposed for the history of the book. Thus, a moment of potential historiographical integration evaporated. Today, the fields would seem to overlap not at all. Now, today I'd like to propose some preliminary and admittedly under-conceptualized and under-researched ideas. I have 2 little kids, so if I just get through the day, I'm pretty happy with myself. Okay, so ideas about what I'm going to present are these under-conceptualized, under-researched ideas about how scholars might go about integrating communication circuits and commodity chains, thus creating what we might call environmental histories of the book. First, I'll examine the ecological footprint of Bancroft's works itself. Next, I'll place Bancroft's work in the larger context of his other business ventures. I'll place his historical works in the larger context of his other ventures. And finally, I'll conclude by broaching a couple of important problems that I think merit further thought. Authors, craftsmen, laborers, and others worked to create each of the 39 volumes of the works from a small assortment of material goods: paper, ink, gilt, glue, and thread, plus a binding of cloth or leather. Unraveling the various commodity chains that came together in Bancroft's book manufactory, the works, if you will, responsible for producing Bancroft's works, shows just how dependent these literary industries were on both the natural world and human work. Start with the bindings. Bancroft's histories were initially advertised in cloth or sheep. Later, subscribers could also purchase the series in, quote, generously gilt calf. Where Bancroft obtained his bindings remains unclear. Leaving aside the provenance of binding cloth, which I know nothing about, it's safe to say that sheep and calf undoubtedly originated in farms and pastures in many parts of the United States and beyond. The skins of living animals became book bindings thanks to a series of transformations facilitated by railroads, slaughterhouses, and tanneries. Economic historian Jeremy Atack argues that the leather tanning industry, including establishments catering to the binding market, quote, became more concentrated as a result of changes in the meatpacking industry, objections to the offensive and polluting nature of the production process, and the chemical revolution, which allowed the substitution of chemical tanning agents for the natural ones formerly used. The covers of Bancroft's works, in short, constitute nothing less than artifacts of an era in which Armour and Swift were mastering the disassembly line. Municipal ordinances were pushing tanning and other nuisance industries to urban margins, and a range of synthetic compounds, some of them quite toxic, were supplanting oak, sumac, and other traditional sources of tannic acid. Now let's peer inside. I wish I had a copy with me and then I could do this, but now let's peer inside. In the course of producing more than 6,000 copies of a work that probably covers close to 30,000 pages in all, Bancroft's firm consumed some 180 million sheets of book paper, plus smaller quantities of end papers. Bancroft, according to Harry Clark, got all his paper, quote, in the East, at a time when several trends in American papermaking were conspiring to produce far-reaching eco-environmental impacts. From the colonial period onward, most U.S. paper was made from a combination of rags and linen. By the mid-19th century, however, as the breakneck growth of U.S. publishing pushed paper demand skyward, the raw materials of papermaking grew scarce and dear. A high-stakes search for alternative sources ensued. Papermakers experimented with straw, jute, corn husks, hemp, asbestos. Good thing they didn't go that route. A grass called esparto, native to North Africa and Iberia. And lastly, wood, a source inspired, interestingly enough, by the obvious example of the wasp. Each of these materials possessed decided advantages and disadvantages. But with the development of both mechanical and chemical processes for removing cellulose from logs, wood paper gained a clear lead over its competitors. By 1880, wood comprised roughly 2/3 of the raw materials U.S. firms turned into paper. And so paper, traditionally made largely from recycled materials, now inflicted a much greater ecological toll. As deforestation devastated the Berkshires and other established paper centers during the 1880s, the industry began to push north, west, and even south, finding new homes in the second-growth forests of Maine, Wisconsin, Ontario, and other places possessing both the clean water papermakers demanded to keep their product pure and stands of prolific second-growth softwoods ideal for pulping. Paper's expanding impact, however, did not stop at the forest's edge. Paper made from wood and other new fibers lacked many of the qualities consumers expected: a surface that absorbed just the right amount of ink, flexibility so that readers and writers could bend or fold sheets of paper without breaking them, and whiteness, which conveyed deeply held notions of purity and status at the same time as it made black ink easier to read in the often dodgy light of the era's interior spaces. In their quest to make a product increasingly composed of wood satisfactory to consumers raised on rag paper, papermakers turned from denizens of the organic to paragons of the synthetic. With surprising abandon, manufacturers treated paper with chlorine bleach, alkaloids, rosin sizers, and an array of other substances, sometimes destroying whole batches of product in their zeal. Papermakers who understood the effects of harsh chemicals so poorly that they damaged their paper, historian Judith McGaugh points out, were unprepared to exercise caution when they disposed of acidic solutions. They simply drained the bleaches into local rivers. Indeed, because they did not view water as a scarce resource, they used large amounts of it to flush lingering traces of bleach from the stock. Further adding to pollution problems was the new practice of supplementing water power with coal-burning steam engines. Satisfying the explosion of print culture in late 19th century America, an explosion in which Bancroft's works constituted just one small factor, this explosion of print culture affected the land, water, and air of the far distant places whose paper Bancroft's works were made from. Lastly, let us move from page to print. From the days of Gutenberg through the early 1800s, printers generally made their own ink, using improvisational combinations of animal and vegetable substances, some of which had been transformed through the agencies of heat and fire. Charcoal, ivory, linseed oil, olive oil, even onions and crusts of bread all made their way into ink. By the 1870s, when the first of Bancroft's works was printed, traditional materials such as charcoal and linseed oil remained in widespread use, while ink makers still jealously guarded what Scientific American called, quote unquote, certain trade secrets. Yet despite these continuities, the ink industry was changing in significant ways. Large ink factories, most of them on the eastern seaboard, now dominated the industry. Increasingly, these establishments relied on a combination of petroleum-based substances, coal-powered machines, and such chemicals as sulfuric acid, each drawn from the proliferating petro-bitumino chemical hinterlands, then emerging as engines of growth for places such as Boston, New York, and New Jersey. Next, let's move to Bancroft's shop. Here, binding, paper, and ink were glued and stitched together. The result was Bancroft's works. Boasting its own steam engine, artesian well, printing presses, and lithographic equipment, Bancroft and Company was one of the largest publishing houses on the West Coast. As such, it employed a large staff of typesetters, lithographers, and other artisans and laborers. By exploring Bancroft's works as material objects, as a contingent combination of materials extracted from nature and transformed by labor, we can glimpse, if only faintly, the far-ranging commodity chains upon which Bancroft and his associates drew to transform manuscript drafts into printed books. Following these chains reminds us, in turn, that the expansion of publishing and reading in the Gilded Age had direct and largely negative ecological consequences. The direct consequences, at least, were negative. Getting myself in some trouble. Certainly, which I will later try to get out of. Certainly, my point is not to vilify Bancroft for this. These processes and dynamics would surely have played out in precisely the manner they did, even had Hubert Howe Bancroft decided to remain a California miner. Instead, my point is to highlight the status of Bancroft's works as manufactured goods, as products of labors that were physical and mechanical, as well as intellectual and literary, and to wonder whether this simple insight might provide a worthwhile opportunity for scholars to further problematize long-vexed questions over authorship. From the death of the author, in other words, we might turn to the death of the tree and the life of the workman. Who knows? Hubert Howe Bancroft, as noted by Richard White and most every other historian who has ever explored the works, was more of a businessman than a historian. No practitioner of our ancient discipline has ever come closer to wedding the construction of historical knowledge to industrial imperatives. It is almost impossible to imagine how either the Bancroft Library or Bancroft's works could ever have come together without continuous and significant infusions of money from Bancroft's business ventures. This fact offers a second way to think about the environmental history of what Bancroft called his literary industries. If, as Adrian Johns argues, a printed book can be seen as a nexus conjoining a wide range of worlds of work, then Bancroft's bookstore, with its 5 floors and its departments devoted to music, law, education, and so forth, served as a focal point for the vast international networks that collectively served to incorporate the Pacific West into a larger and inextricably transnational print culture. Bancroft's vertically integrated set of operations with its 9 departments, each Bancroft claimed in itself as large as an ordinary business in our line of trade, had no equal anywhere in the West. Bancroft estimated that his firm was responsible for fully half the books printed in the state prior to 1870. As a book and stationery merchant, he also sold works published in Boston, New York, London, Paris, and beyond, while serving as an outlet for fine writing paper, envelopes, blank books, and legal forms. The indirect impact of Bancroft's works on the forests and fauna, the fields and waters of the United States and Europe and probably Mexico, surely dwarfed the direct toll that, that this historical project had on the regions that supplied paper, gilt, animal skins, and other things from which the works were made. Into and out of Bancroft's store, by cart, steamship, and railroad, moved the material signifiers by which science, law, history, and other fields asserted their emerging imperial sway over nature, over indigenous peoples, over culture and knowledge, and most everything else. Not surprisingly, the firm did brisk business throughout San Francisco's Pacific and interior hinterlands, ranging from British Columbia to northern Mexico, and from Utah to Hawaii and China. To appreciate the interrelationship of Bancroft's shop with the wide-ranging environmental transformations responsible for remaking the North American West and the Pacific world in this age of industrialization, one need only consider 3 of Bancroft's biggest sellers. First, maps, which played a critical role in helping newcomers to California and the West navigate, read, and ultimately change the country. Second, law books, the most profitable part of Bancroft's publishing business, which facilitated what Willard Hearst famously called the release of economic energy, a release that environmental historians have shown to have had deep and enduring effects on Western places. And finally, labels for the salmon canneries, which Bancroft actually sold quite a few of. Selling labels to these canneries, which so methodically set about with the help of a mobile labor force of non-white others, to turn the living, churning lifeblood of the Pacific coast into a highly preserved, highly marketable commodity. Bancroft, like many successful business people then and now, ultimately found the world of business rather boring. His ennui with commerce inspired his literary industries, of course, but his instincts for profit remained sharp. After taking a liking to San Diego, Bancroft started buying up lots around Old Town, Newtown, Spring Valley, and elsewhere, eventually acquiring more than 100 parcels. The historian's motivations for playing the real estate market were initially purely speculative. He prophesied that San Diego would eventually boom. Louis, you owe me. See how it worked boom in there? Boom. All right. So he predicted that San Diego would boom, and he planned to cash in on his foresight. Personal benefits, however, would also accrue. Bancroft's son, like so many Americans of the late 19th century, suffered from respiratory problems. Bancroft, ever nostalgic for the rural Ohio farm on which he grew up, responded by trying to engineer a return to the land. In 1886, he planned a seasonal and largely symbolic retreat from the urban industrial world of San Francisco to a pastoral tract outside San Diego named Helix Farms. While planning the construction of this country home, Bancroft received a telegram bringing news he'd long feared. Fire, perhaps the most commonplace manner in which the supposedly remote and vanquished power of nature reminded Gilded Age urbanites of its enduring power, had destroyed Bancroft's San Francisco store. The bookseller carried insurance, but not enough to cover initial estimates of the loss. After retreating into a phase of crippling depression, understandably so, Bancroft and his associates resolved to rebuild the firm. In response to this financial trauma, as well as to the continuing failure of the historical branches of the business to meet their expenses, let alone to turn a profit, Bancroft made a fateful decision. He increasingly forsook historical scholarship for commercial promotion. Thus, a project once obligated chiefly, though as most of us know, not entirely, to accuracy and to the historical record as documented by the Bancroft Library, was rededicated to promoting the further eco-ecological transformation of Western North America while massaging the vanity of those capitalist elites who stood to profit most from the projects advertised and advocated by Bancroft's new works. The Resources and Development of Mexico, for instance, an 1893 work supposedly encouraged by President Porfirio Diaz, urged American entrepreneurs to invest in Mexican farms, ranches, mines, and factories, while the Book of Wealth unabashedly celebrated the pursuit and accumulation of money as the worthiest endeavor of the age. During these same years, Bancroft commanded his literary workers to embark on Chronicles of the Builders and Chronicles of the Kings, two of the final volumes of the works. For inclusion in these unscholarly, sycophantic tomes, businessmen paid $1,000 for a steel portrait and 4 pages of print. Moguls such as Collis Huntington and Henry Tabor, meanwhile, handed over $10,000 for longer profiles, some of which exceeded 100 pages. Thanks almost entirely to these wealthy subscribers, Bancroft's History Company began to turn a profit and even to pay substantial dividends. If the balance sheet for Bancroft's works ultimately ended up in the black, such commercial success ultimately doomed the History Company's already troubled reputation. Bancroft's industrial mode of producing history initially generated widespread interest and acclaim. By the 1880s, though, critics attacked Bancroft's methods with unprecedented venom. And the conference program, the conference poster is a great example of that, the 1885 cartoon in the Wasp, sort of mocking the boss historian, I think is indicative of this shift that took place over the course of the 1880s. Subscribers, for their part, expressed displeasure not so much with how the works were produced, but instead with the manner in which they were sold. I don't know. A superstition about trying to talk over bells. But it is 10, so I guess I have to. Okay. Incessant complaints, the breaking of some 4,000 out of the 10,000 contracts signed by subscribers to the works, and a rash of lawsuits, including an expensive, widely publicized, and ultimately unsuccessful legal battle to force Leland Stanford to continue his subscription, together weakened the History Company's bottom line and damaged Bancroft's already controversial public image. As Bancroft's disgruntled former assistant Henry Oak aptly phrased it in 1891, the works dwelled, quote, under a cloud, being as if by tacit agreement avoided or ignored by leading writers of the country. Beneath the surface of subscriber resistance coursed opposition not only to the cost and quality of the works. Subscriptions cost anywhere from $175 to $400, depending on the binding selected. And few readers then or now could stomach what Oak accurately called the dry-as-dust monotony of the series. So despite these problems with cost and quality, we can perhaps detect misgivings. We can perhaps detect subscribers' misgivings with Bancroft's efforts to chart a comprehensive history for a region that sprawled across a dozen nations. The American farmers, small-town merchants, and other folks of modest means who filled most of Bancroft's subscription lists rejected the historian's efforts to imagine what Bancroft called the Pacific States into a mental territory. While the work sought to chart something of a shared history for the Pacific peoples, a history which ultimately subordinated Indians, Spaniards, Russians, mestizos, Aleuts, and others to the main drama of Anglo-American ascendance, Bancroft's histories nonetheless told a story few Americans seemed ready or willing to buy, at least not on Bancroft's terms. Now, there is, of course, a third critical angle that I've almost entirely ignored, the ideas of nature that suffuse the text of the works. The next step for me, once I resolve myself to actually digging in further into the works, I've read about 2.5 volumes, and I have to say, in my opinion, Henry Oak has it about right. They're tough going for the most part, so I need to roll up my sleeves and dig in there and examine what the works themselves have to say about human-nature relationships across time. At this point, since I haven't done that work, I'd like to conclude by pointing out a few of the challenges that I've yet to undertake. So first, I've not yet exhausted Darnton's communications circuit, for readers have been mostly absent in my analysis. How to get at these readers and how to bring the tools of environmental history to bear on the study of readership is a task that will certainly prove difficult and possibly pointless. Second, looking at what the works actually say raises an exciting possibility that is, of course, also a daunting challenge. The word text, as D.F. McKinsey tells us, derives from the Latin word to weave. It refers to the, quote, woven state, the web or texture of materials. The web or texture of the materials, and it could be applied to the interlacing or entwining of any kind of material. According to McKenzie, it is only by virtue of a metaphoric shift that text applies to language, that the verb to weave serves for the verb to write, that the web of words becomes a text. And so I'll stop by pointing out that my next move is to determine how, if at all, I might possibly integrate what I've shared today about text as material objects with what I need to learn about the particular ways in which the physicality of the works shape the ideas of nature woven out of the worlds of work and nature I've explored today. So, thank you.
Good morning. I'm working old tech this morning. I have some illustrations, but I need an assistant to actually carry this off. There we go. That's the man we've been talking about. Hubert Howe Bancroft. My talk this morning is called Bolton, the Bancroft, and the Struggle for American History. Perhaps it could be equally or even better titled The Shaping of American History. Great libraries take decades, even centuries, to assemble. The configuration of a research library like the Bancroft is not foreordained, but is the product of many people who bring their own ideas and needs to bear on the institution. If we want to understand why a library is what it is, we must look beyond the catalog in order to understand the ideas that motivated the personalities who assembled it. The library that we have today is much more than the core of materials that Bancroft amassed in his 4 decades and then sold to the University of California in 1905. Curators, directors, and librarians have continued to collect, expand, and elaborate on Bancroft's basic collections. My subject today is the pivotal first half-century of the library as part of the University of California, a period when Herbert Bolton and his students directed the fortunes of the Bancroft. Now, it is not generally recognized that one of the most influential personalities associated with California's acquisition and development of the Bancroft was Frederick Jackson Turner. 2, please. Turner, a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin, had become one of the most important historians of his generation because of his famous essay, The Significance of the Frontier in American History. And this is Turner in 1898. He contended that the existence of free, so-called free, Western land attracted pioneers who developed the essential traits and institutions that made the United States distinctive and great: self-reliance and democratic government. Historians have been arguing about Turner's ideas ever since. While Turner gave the frontier experience top billing as a cause for the distinctive development of the United States, his Anglo-centric vision of history is famous for relegating non-whites to a mere obstructive role as what he called barriers to civilization. The modern critique of Turner as an ethnocentric nationalist is too obvious and too well known to bear repeating here. But at the turn of the century, Turner was a towering figure, and his ideas were well accepted. Major universities competed for his services, and Western universities were especially interested in Turner because his ideas validated and valorized the history of the Western region. So, in 1904, a young and ambitious California university attempted to lure Frederick Jackson Turner to its history faculty. But in order to get him, they needed to acquire a research library that could support his work. Hubert Howe Bancroft's great library was for sale for about $300,000. If the university bought the Bancroft, would it be sufficient for Turner's needs? Turner replied that its value would depend on, quote, how large a proportion is devoted to the early Indian and Spanish materials. If, he went on, the Bancroft Library was chiefly comprised of Indian and Spanish records, Turner thought that it would not be worth the money. Not be worth the money. It would be better to purchase, and this is a quote, the documentary material for the American period of the history of the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific Coast. Remarkably, Turner believed that too large a proportion of Spanish records actually devalued the Bancroft collections as resources for a university library, at least for his university library. People often weep when I read this part. Consequently, Stanford University did not buy the Bancroft Library, and we sit here today instead of in Palo Alto. Stanford did not give up on its pursuit of Turner, but began to assemble a new library for him. In 1905, Henry Moore Stevens, chair of the University of California History Department, here we can go to 3, also tried to hire Turner. But Cal had the same problem that Stanford had, no research library. I could have found a more distinguished photo of Professor Stevens, but this is actually an important image because here he is at the Bohemian Grove. He was a member of the Bohemian Club, which was very important for his purposes of promoting the university. Benjamin Ide Wheeler was also a member of the Bohemian Club. And of course, this gave them access to the California elite families and money and donations and so forth, which they sorely needed. Stevens was convinced that the Bancroft would indeed serve Turner's needs, but he knew that he would need to be won over. So Stevens asked Turner's friend Reuben Gold Thwaites, librarian of the Wisconsin State Historical Society, to appraise the Bancroft. Thwaites' appraisal was enthusiastic. The Bancroft took, quote, high rank among the famous general collections of Americana, such as exist at Harvard University, the Boston Public Library, the Library of Congress, the New York State Library, and the Wisconsin Historical Library, which was, of course, Turner's beloved home library. The Bancroft would work for Turner, all right, even though it happened to have a lot of old stuff about Indians and Spaniards. So Stevens and President Benjamin Ide Wheeler induced the regents to buy Bancroft's library, in part as a tactic to induce Turner to move to Berkeley. They eventually settled on a price of $150,000, which Bancroft justified by saying, well, I'll give $150,000 for the library. So that way he could claim that he got $300,000 for it, even though he really only got $150,000 for it. So in the meantime, the Bancroft remained housed in San Francisco, in Bancroft's old library over there, while the Doe Library was being erected. Slide 4, please. So, as 1906 unfolded, and I like this because it shows the sort of chaos of construction that dissolves into nothingness. And this is taken from Old North Hall, which has now been destroyed. It looks across the space that the Bancroft Library now occupies towards South Hall. As 1906 unfolded, Stanford and Berkeley were avidly courting Turner with their competing library schemes. Stanford's new collections that would be custom built for Turner, and Cal's newly acquired Bancroft that presumably already met Turner's needs. Neither suitor won the bride. In April, the great earthquake struck Northern California and San Francisco burned. The catastrophe caused Turner to pull out of the California prenuptial competition for the time being. But his role in California academic library affairs was not over, as we shall see. The earthquake and fire in San Francisco propelled a new personality into the Bancroft, Frederick J. Teggart. Now, some of you may, and that's number 5, please. Some of you may remember seeing piled on the table yesterday outside the exhibition a very thick white volume on the life and works of Frederick J. Teggart. This is that guy. Nobody but me picked one up. You'll see I have an interest. Teggart had a bachelor's degree from Stanford, but no advanced degree. Stevens had hired him to teach UC Extension courses in San Francisco. Now, this is Teggart in old age. I think he was born in 1874 or thereabouts. Pardon me. Teggart, who was a librarian of the San Francisco Mechanics Library, which burned to the ground after the earthquake, hastened to the Bancroft Library in San Francisco while the flames still raged. Fortunately, the Bancroft was out of the path of the fire. Stevens must have felt doubly lucky because Teggart promptly took charge of the Bancroft during the crisis. Now, Stevens had an experienced librarian who was connected to Cal, overseeing and protecting the precious Bancroft. When the library was moved to Berkeley, Teggart moved with it as the library's new curator. He also joined the history department, despite the fact that he did not have an advanced degree in history. Once the dust from the quake settled, Stevens still hoped to hire Turner. But in the meantime, he began to build an administrative structure and a Western regional raison d'etre for the Bancroft. In 1907, Stevens founded the Academy of Pacific Coast History. The new academy was a part of the university with a council that included President Wheeler, Phoebe Apperson Hearst, James K. Moffett, Rudolph Taussig, and other representatives of California's fortunes. And if you'd give us number 6, please. These well-heeled donors, Stephen hoped, would provide financial support for the work of the Bancroft Library and for the program of scholarly publication that he envisioned. Now, this is Benjamin Ide Wheeler, and we sit now in his hall. I just thought you should see him. Stevens told Turner that he was organizing the newly acquired library with Turner in mind. At the Bancroft, a doctoral student, and here I hesitate in honor of all the doctoral students out there. So what he really means here is a mere doctoral student. Okay. At the Bancroft, a doctoral student, he explained to Turner, would be handling, quote, the Spanish materials, and you, Turner, have a perfect mind without it. Imagine, it was all turned over to one doctoral student. The purchase of the Bancroft, Stevens goes on, shows the trend of the university towards historical productions, and the Academy of Pacific Coast History will be our own publishing mechanism. So there it was, an historical kingdom for Turner to reign over, a library, means for publication, and a fund-raising arm, all arranged in a way that conformed to Turner's ideas and needs. Everything was in place, except Turner. Now, the Academy never worked exactly as Stevens hoped it would. In the early years, you had about a half a dozen donors who gave $500 a year. And those donations paid for the curator's salary, it paid all of Teggert's salary, it paid for assistants' salaries, it paid for any new acquisitions. But they're only bringing in anywhere from $3,000 to $6,000 a year, which was not enough. This eventually will cause a problem. Okay, so while we're courting Turner, Stanford now has a problem. They have a new library building, and they're trying to build a library for Turner, but it's becoming increasingly clear they're not going to get Turner. But they need somebody to work in this library and to teach Western history. So, who would do it? In 1908, Turner helped them out. He recommended Herbert E. Bolton for the Stanford job. Slide 7, please. Bolton had been a student of Turner's at Wisconsin, although he finished the doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania. In 1901, Bolton took a job at the University of Texas, where he began to discover what we now call Spanish borderlands history. This is Bolton when he was at Texas, probably taken in 1903 or 4, something. Oh, I think it's dated 1906, actually. So, he discovers borderlands history. He begins to scour the Mexican archives for Spanish colonial documents that elucidated the history of Texas. But he also made a spectacular find associated with early 19th century Western U.S. history, the lost papers of Lieutenant Zebulon Montgomery Pike. After Pike crossed illegally into New Mexico with a U.S. exploring expedition in 1807, Spanish officials arrested Pike and his men. They also seized Pike's papers, which were retained when he was repatriated to the U.S. Bolton's discovery of the papers a century later resulted in an article in the American Historical Review, a special session on the American Historical Association program, and instant fame in the American historical profession, insofar as one can actually become famous as an American historian. With With Turner's recommendation, Stanford hired Bolton in 1909. Bolton began to cross the bay on a regular basis to exploit the Bancroft. Meanwhile, Stevens continued his negotiations with Turner, using the Bancroft as a lure. Turner was seriously interested, and in fact, it looked like he was just about to finally sign off. But at that moment, Harvard came along and made him an offer, and Turner answered. So Cambridge, not Berkeley or Palo Alto, became Turner's new home. Now Berkeley had a library and no one of great stature to work in it. What to do? Bolton was in the neighborhood, but a gentleman's agreement between the Stanford and Berkeley against rating each other's faculties seemed to prohibit hiring him. Then, by luck, the department chair at Texas dropped dead, and the Lone Star State recalled Bolton. Stevens then claimed that since Bolton had decided to leave Stanford, that he was fair game, and he made him an offer. And so it happened that Herbert Bolton crossed the bay as once again the consolation prize for Frederick Jackson Turner. The terms of Bolton's position at Berkeley are revealing. He came to Berkeley as a full professor. Stevens made him the assistant chair of the history department with full authority over all of American history, including curriculum and recommendations for appointments, promotion, and salary. Among his recommendations were the hiring of two of his first doctoral students, Herbert Priestley and Charles Chapman. Bolton was also a curator, was also appointed assistant curator of the Bancroft Library, where Teggart reigned as curator. Oddly, Teggart taught American history, so Bolton had departmental authority over him. This division of responsibility led to friction and would not last. In 1915, open feuding between the two men broke out when Teggart restricted Bolton's use of the Bancroft. Imagine someone restricting Bolton's use of the Bancroft. One Saturday afternoon, someone overheard the rising voices of Bolton and Teggart in the history department offices. Teggart insisted that as curator, he had the authority to keep Bolton out of the Bancroft whenever he pleased. Bolton threatened to knock Teggart's false teeth down his throat if he tried it. Those were the days. Duking it out for control of the Bancroft. Think of it, Charles. Violence did not erupt, although I'd have paid to see that one, I'll tell you. But the bad feelings remained and would have repercussions for both men. Teggart was on shaky ground. Without an advanced degree, Teggart represented an older generation of autodidactic university professors who were being steadily phased out of regular faculty appointments at Berkeley and elsewhere. Realizing this, Teggart and Stevens had agreed that if Teggart published a book that satisfied the requirements for the PhD, that the University of California would confer the degree under Stevens' mentorship. When Teggart published his book in 1916, Stevens reneged on the agreement, demoted Teggart, and made Bolton the new curator of the Bancroft. All this transpired, no doubt, with Bolton's hearty approval. Soon, Bolton's title was upgraded to director of the Bancroft. The Academy of Pacific Coast History eventually went out of existence, and the Bancroft was administered as a regular part, or as a part of the university library. I'm not exactly sure when the Academy was finally dispensed with, but by 1910 it was clear that it wasn't working as they had hoped, so they had turned over all of the budgetary needs of the Bancroft to the university as a whole. The Board of Regents took over the funding mechanism for the Bancroft. Control of the Bancroft enabled Bolton to emphasize his own interests in Southwestern and Mexican history when making new acquisitions. He arranged for his doctoral student, Herbert I. Priestley, to be appointed to the history faculty as assistant director of the Bancroft. I thought I'd brought a photo of him and Bolton together, but it turns out it's someone else, so I won't put it up there for you. It was Priestley, who was a specialist in Spanish colonial history, who administered the Bancroft on a day-to-day basis, while Bolton was the Bancroft's public face and premier scholar and fundraiser. As I was saying just the other day, as you will recall, Bolton is finally in charge of the Bancroft, and he's beginning to pardon me, emphasize his own interests in making new acquisitions. But it was his student, the assistant director, Herbert Priestley, who was also a specialist in Spanish colonial history, who really administered the Bancroft Library on a day-to-day basis, with Bolton as the Bancroft's public face and premier scholar and fundraiser. Bolton had begun to collect documents from Mexico for the University of Texas, and he'd continued this at Stanford and Cal. At the Bancroft, he and Priestley directed collection efforts in Mexico and Spain. Bolton worked with the native sons of the Golden West to fund graduate research, including 2 annual traveling fellowships that enabled research in foreign archives. While doing their own dissertation research, graduate students also copied and collected original documents for the Bancroft Library. Some of them made a little extra money by making copies for other libraries on the side, but I won't get into that. The invention of the 35mm Leica camera made these expeditions even more efficient. So for decades, Bolton sent out Berkeley students who collected materials for the Bancroft. The worth of it to scholars today truly cannot be estimated. The breadth of Bolton's interests may also be measured in the courses that he taught. Could you give me 9, please? In 1919, Professor Stevens died. You may notice a kind of theme here, an unfortunate one, but 9. It's all right. Stevens died, and Bolton became chair of the history department. He immediately instituted a 2-semester freshman-level course called The History of the Americas. The idea behind Bolton's course was that students should have a working knowledge of the history of the hemisphere before they took national history courses, including the history of the United States. Under Bolton, the Bancroft's collection policies with regard to the hemisphere are at least in part an artifact of Bolton's conviction that the Americas should be the basic organizing concept for American history. Bolton's direct influence over the Bancroft temporarily ended in 1940 when he retired at age 70. But Priestley, Bolton's loyal and like-minded student, took over as director. In less than 2 years, however, Priestley had a debilitating stroke that finally killed him. World War II made it impossible to immediately hire a replacement for Priestley, so Bolton was hired to fill the position and to teach for a couple more years during the war. When Bolton retired again, he lobbied for the appointment of George P. Hammond as the new Bancroft director. If you'd go to 10. Oh, before we move away from this last slide, by the way, pictures him in front of one of the great maps that he had made up for this huge course where he lectured to 1,000 people at a crack. And so he had to have the big map behind him in order to lecture up. And he did this down here in the main auditorium in Wheeler Hall. So now to 10. Bolton lobbied successfully for the appointment of George Hammond as the new director of the Bancroft Library. Hammond, who is on the far left here, this is Bolton in the middle, and another of Bolton's students, Aubrey Neesham, who was with the National Park Service. Bolton was famous for exploring the trails that his Spanish explorers had pioneered a couple of centuries beforehand. He made these very meticulous studies of the trail and took him out in the Southwest for weeks at a time. Anyway, Hammond is on the far left. He was dean of the University of New Mexico Graduate School. He was, as I say, also a doctoral student of Bolton's, with a long list of publications in Spanish colonial history that were much like his mentors in style and tone. Hammond often accompanied Bolton on his southwestern exploring expeditions. He is given credit, once he became director, for modernizing and expanding the library's holdings, which still reflected a broad national or multinational outlook that Bolton would have approved. Hammond directed the Bancroft until his retirement in 1965. Bolton, Priestley, and Hammond thus administered the Bancroft in one way or another for 54 years. Number 11, please. It may be argued that Bolton's influence merely extended Bancroft's original perspective on North American history, and there is some truth to that. This is Bolton in his old age in his office with two secretaries who often helped him with his translation and editing of Spanish documents. And if you look carefully in the center of the desk, you will see an ashtray and a package of cigarettes. Thank you for smoking. We smoked in the Bancroft in those days. We smoked all of the time, and Bolton smoked all of the time. He nearly burned the place down one day, but times have changed. It may be, well, I've already said that, but to fully appreciate what Bolton did in the Bancroft, we've got to return to Turner. Had Turner joined the Berkeley faculty in 1910, we may assume that Turner would have had at least as much influence over American history at Berkeley as Bolton had. But this raises the question, what was American history? For Bolton, American history was the history of the Americas from Tierra del Fuego to the Arctic Sea. For Turner, American history was defined as the history of the United States. Bolton claimed to be a devoted disciple of Turner's, but their perspectives were very different. Turner's frontier moved westward from the English colonies on the East Coast to the Midwest. Despite the fact that he spent a good deal of time in California, Turner scarcely took the trans-Mississippi West into consideration, much less the Hispanic Southwest. Bolton could never convince Turner that his work should be part of Turner's sectional analysis of U.S. history. Bolton argued that the borderlands were the meeting place and merging place of two streams of European culture, Anglo and Hispanic. Turner was convinced that Anglo culture, modified by frontier experience, rolled over all predecessors who were not worthy of serious consideration, let alone the dignity of merging with his pioneers. While it seems unlikely that Turner would have taken on an administrative role for the Bancroft, he surely would have influenced its collection policies in ways that we can only guess at today. It seems impossible that he would have advocated using the resources of the university or the donations of the native sons to expand the Bancroft holdings in Spanish and Mexican documents. There is every reason to believe that he would have urged the Bancroft to acquire more materials related to what Turner called the, quote, truly American, close quote, advance of Anglo pioneers. This was in a letter to Bolton, by the way. Would Turner have ruined the Bancroft? Of course not. But at the very least, Turner's influence would have shifted the emphasis away from Spanish colonial to Anglo-American history. Under Turner's guidance in the early 20th century, the Bancroft would have become a very different place than the one we see today. Does today's Bancroft reflect Bolton's historical vision? Of course it does. Is there a better place than the Bancroft to explore the many meanings of borderlands that we have heard so much about at this symposium? Is there a better library in which to study the transnational histories of the Americas than this place? We may fault Bolton for many reasons, but not for the marks he and Priestley and Hammond left on the Bancroft Library in the second half-century of its existence. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to Charles for inviting me to give the presentation today. Thanks to Richard for a very generous introduction. And thank you to all of you for coming back from lunch. I realize we're behind schedule, but I had a double espresso for lunch. And my paper will be done in 3 minutes, and we're going to be back on schedule. Yeah. Now, it is very open-minded of Bancroft to invite me to speak on this occasion because almost everything I know about Bancroft I learned in the last 24 hours. I had no idea he had 8 arms. And my presentation is almost completely innocent of that new knowledge. What I'm presenting today is the start of an essay that I've been invited to do for a collection of essays edited by Eric Foner called The New American History. So this is a series that gets revised about every 15 years or so. And so I've been invited to do the Colonial America essay in that particular volume. Now, in the last 15 years, there's been an extraordinary surge of literature in my field, as in all fields. And so it certainly seems somewhat absurd to try to synthesize it at the extent of a single essay. And particularly because in my field of early American history, we've greatly expanded the geographic imagined space that we're dealing with. It's certainly continental, but it's more than continental, and it's more than transatlantic. It's really become a subset of global history. And certainly Richard's work on the middle ground and his other work has been highly influential in this particular turn in the field. And of course, when you go to that larger scale, what inevitably, and you've got a short space to do, is you wash out a lot of the rich particularity and the biographical detail, which is what particularly intrigues me about doing history. So what I'm going to try to do today is to operate between a couple of these scales, which is also something that Richard has written about, is the different scales that we operate in. And I want to begin with a particular map and particular people who made that map and try to go to a larger scale and think about its implications for how we think about the field of colonial history. So the map I want to talk about is not this one. I just put this up first because this is more the type of map that we're familiar with, in which there seems to be some sort of correlation between geographic scale and then the social information which is coded in it. Instead, I want to talk about this map. Now, this map has really struck my eye when I first saw it. And the more that I've thought about it and read about it, the more compelling it has become for me. This map is a paper copy of an original map, which was originally put on a deerskin and was given to the royal governor of South Carolina, who had arrived relatively recently, a man named Francis Nicholson. And you can see the paper copy is attempting to be a pretty exact copy, right down to showing representations of part of the deer hide. So here are the 4 legs on one side, 4 legs up here, and back here. Now, the makers of this map were people who we've come to call the Catawba Indians. These were Siouan-speaking peoples who lived in the Carolina Piedmont. Many of you may know James Merrill's very fine book about the Catawba Indians. But you'll note that on this map, which is again a paper copy, where some clerk has put English labels onto here, which almost certainly were not on the original map as created by a Catawba Indian, the word Catawba does not appear there. Instead, there are 11 names of native groups. We can call them clusters of villages. There's Kasui, Chara, Nassau, Nusti, Naxipaha, Suka, Sudari, Wasmisa, Wateri, Wiapi, and Yuchi. So they thought of themselves not as the Catawba. This is a name that's being imposed upon them by the colonizers as a convenience to lump them together because of a certain alliance that these 11 peoples have. So they very much still think of themselves as these 11 distinct peoples in names that are generally not now familiar to us because as historians we are usually working with these labels of convenience which the colonizers have provided for us. And it washes out the extraordinary ethnic diversity of these people. By no means did they speak all the same language. They spoke related languages that were Siouan. Now, there are two additional native peoples represented. Up here, the Cherokee, and here are the Chickasaw, who are more familiar to us. Again, these are more collective designations of peoples who were themselves coalitions or confederations. But those people who are more familiar to us are presented on the margins of this map rather than at its center. This is not one undifferentiated map of Indian peoples. Instead, this is introducing us to a complex network of diverse peoples. And this is certainly not a purely native document. This is a hybrid document. This is part of a dialogue with colonizers trying to explain the native world to them. And so I'm not at all sure that native peoples would have created this type of map except for the need to explain themselves to a British official. And it is a didactic document. More than trying to explain how the world actually was, it's an explanation of how the world should be. And in particular, it's an explanation of how British colonial officials ought to deal with the native peoples on their immediate frontier. It's an introduction to a world which is not imagined as a future colonial world, but as a native world that has a certain imagined stability which the colonizers have to come to terms with and ought to understand the particular native logic of how you do diplomacy and trade in order to fit into this world. As I mentioned before, it doesn't show geographic proportions. It does indicate an array of peoples who extend westward at least as far as the Mississippi River, which is where the Chickasaw lived. But their exact location on this particular map is not an exact one of where they lived on that landscape. Okay? It's, in a way, this is similar to a subway system map, in that it is giving you information about certain relations between people and certain connections between those people, and it's suppressing other information. It doesn't include all of the native peoples that would have appeared in that particular world. There are many native peoples left out. In particular, the Cherokee are not on there, the Creek are not indicated, and the Choctaw are not indicated. So what is indicated here is not all of the native peoples who lived within a certain defined geographic space, but instead it's a depiction of an alliance network. And in that alliance network, you'll see that the circles come in varying sizes, and they come in different locations. And size matters, and centrality matters. So the larger the circle and the more central the circle, the more powerful the people are imagined to be in this network. And you can see then that the people who are right at the center of things, right here, the Nassau, it's almost certain that the particular map maker was a Nassau. And he's trying to convey then to the colonizers that, yeah, it seems like there's a whole blur of Indian peoples out there, but it's actually a very complex network which has a logic to it, and the Nassau have the pride of place. They are the most important people for you to deal with. And in fact, for a fair number of other native peoples, you ought to first come to us. Now, in addition, we've got these circles, there are some square representations here. And these represent the colonial world in two manifestations. This is Virginia, and this represents Charlestown, South Carolina. And there are convenient labels of Charlestown in Virginia there. So whereas the native peoples are the well-rounded people, the colonizers are the squares. Now you can see this kind of rectilinear grid, and if we look at one of our type of maps of the streets and the buildings in Charleston, you can see that rectangular lots and a rectangular grid of streets and rectangular buildings are hallmarks of that culture and would have been quite striking to native peoples. Also square imagery. This shows Martin's Hundred near Jamestown, Virginia, and it shows a kind of square fort that was laid out there. Or here is an imagined landscape at Jamestown showing square lots and square buildings. Now for native peoples then, there's something defining about the circular form, and we're familiar with Native American architecture and the circularity of so-called teepees and wigwams and even longhouses with their rounded edges. If any of you have been to the Smithsonian, the new Smithsonian Museum of Native American Cultures and History, you'll note that there isn't a right angle in it anywhere, that it is a set of circular and ovoid spaces, and that's by design. So this map is conveying that there's a powerful cultural difference between the colonizers, who are represented in square forms, and the Native Americans, who are represented in these circular forms. But between these peoples, there are paths, which are these parallel lines. And so these are imagined to be paths. Now, paths are certainly real physical objects on the landscape, but they're also understood in metaphoric terms, that these are routes by which people can safely communicate and trade with each other. And so it's not random, the ability to pass through a Native American-controlled landscape, that you have to go in the kind of the proper sequence where you were expected to go. Otherwise, there's the potential that you are an enemy rather than a friend. And that's what this map is primarily trying to explain to Francis Nicholson, the Royal Governor of South Carolina, which is what the network is and what the procedure is. If, for example, you want to send a message to the Sudaree, you first have to go to the Nassau. Now, they accept the reality that these colonizers are making an end run, literally, around them to contact up here, the Cherokee and the Chickasaw. But it's presented as unnatural. It's a way of kind of going beyond the natural flow, which would be through the Nassau and then connect over to the Chickasaw. Now, this is a highly selected, I think I indicated that, and we know this because there are some other maps like this that were produced. Indeed, Francis Nicholson collected a 1723 map made by the Chickasaw, and they naturally put themselves at the center of that map, and they put the various Catawba peoples as minor peoples on the periphery of it. So you can imagine that almost every native people might understand geographic space in this way, but they're going to rearrange who's at the center and who is the largest circle. Now, the map conveys that certainly there's this powerful difference between these two cultures, but it also indicates the possibility of coexistence, because they are, the colonial entities are shown as connected by paths to the Native American entities. It's, in a way, this map powerfully inverts our usual expectations. Al referred to Turner's concept of Indians as just speed bumps, as obstacles in the way of an expansion which seems inevitable because of the power of the colonizers. Well, this is a map which is suggesting that that power is not overwhelming, that native peoples don't expect to be overwhelmed, that instead what they expect is to be able to teach colonizers proper manners. And this map shows a great deal of optimism that their particular way of thinking about the world could be taught to the colonizers. Now, this particular, what we're looking at is a paper copy which was made by Francis Nicholson, some clerk of Francis Nicholson, and then was given as a gift. So it's initially, the initial deer hide is a gift from certain Catawba peoples, giving it to Nicholson. Nicholson then makes paper copies and uses them as gifts to give to his patrons in Britain. And they include the Prince of Wales. So this belonged to the Prince of Wales, this particular paper copy. So it shows Nicholson's sense that there is a curiosity in Britain about the complexity of the native world, and he thought that this would then be a token of the kind of gift that's reciprocity for the various favors that he had received from the hierarchy in Great Britain. It is therefore kind of a linkage between the Native American world and the transatlantic world that Nicholson is part of. Now, there are some other figures on here, and I just want to call your attention to this figure, which looks to be a woman because the object seems to be wearing a skirt. Unlike the other objects on this map, there is no English label on it. So this seems to have been of much greater interest to whoever produced the map than it was to the English who received the map. It's tempting to think of this as some kind of spiritual being, but that's just pure speculation. Now, also there are two figures here which do conveniently have a label. And what they represent is an Indian hunter here and a deer. The map is conveying that quite central to the relationship between these native peoples and the colonizers of South Carolina is a trade in deerskins, in which native peoples are the hunters, and as does the very material which this map originally appeared on, which was a deer hide. Now, there's one other figure here, and this always tricks people. I should show this. It looks like a parachute, okay? And that's because our eyes, when we look at an image like this, we think this is the top and this is the bottom, and it's encouraged by the labels which do that. But this was meant as an object. The original map didn't have those labels, and it was meant as an object that you walked all around, and all sides of it were meant to be equal. And the center is what's most important, not what's on the top, as with in contrast to our maps. So what this is a ship. This is a mast, and these are the ropes that come down to the vessel of the ship. And so this is meant to be a symbol of Charlestown, that Charleston's a place where you saw these strange objects, these big ships capable of going across the Atlantic. So again, this is a map that's at the intersection of a transatlantic world and a continental world. And what I want to then do is just talk a little bit more about Nicholson. Nicholson's own life shows about the growing geographic scale of the English and becoming British Empire. He's born in Yorkshire in 1655. He joins the King's Army, is a veteran officer, and he serves in Flanders, in Tangier, in what's now Morocco, and in Boston, before he then becomes a royal governor of first New York and then of Virginia. He reverts back to the King's Army and will lead a failed expedition to try to conquer French Canada in 1709, and then a more successful venture which does conquer Acadia, which then becomes Nova Scotia under British rule, and Nicholson would be the first royal governor of Nova Scotia. Subsequently, he would become the first royal governor of South Carolina, which had previously been a proprietary colony. So in his own career, it is all over the map on both sides of the Atlantic and almost thoroughly throughout the British colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. In the course of this, he came to understand the importance of Indian alliances to colonial security, and as a consequence, he's collecting these maps. I'm going to use this map then to try to introduce readers to two different, but I think highly compatible approaches to thinking about colonial America. One is much better developed and is more familiar to most people, and that's so-called Atlantic history. And this is the notion of the ongoing importance of transatlantic networks of trade and communication to the ongoing development of the Americas. And this involves, of course, Africa, as well as Europe. But I'm also interested in what's come to be called continental history. If Atlantic history has a downside, is that the emphasis is very much upon European initiative in creating these networks. And what can be lost sight of is the role of native peoples in their own initiative in trying to respond to the presence of colonizers in the world. And so historians who've been called continental historians are very interested in how native peoples are structuring their own response in ways that then compel concessions from the colonizers. I'm going to, in this essay, then try to introduce these two bodies and to suggest that they're not competitors, but that we need to combine them to make any sense out of colonial North America. What we then would find is that very much an interpenetration of Native American networks and colonial networks, of mutual dependence between these peoples. Colonizers needed Indians. They needed them as guides. They needed them as trading partners. They needed them as military allies. They needed them as potential converts for their spiritual enterprises. And so we tend to think then of these native peoples as Nicholson's, this network here, as Nicholson thought of it, as information that would help him to penetrate that world and transform it. But what it's meant by native peoples is a way to incorporate colonizers on the terms of those native peoples in ways that will perpetuate native autonomy in the interior of the continent. And Indians were certainly able to compel major concessions from colonial peoples who have to forego for very long stretches of time their kind of fantasies of exercising a total control over native peoples. So what I would like to invite you and to invite readers to do is to imagine this particular map multiplied across the continent with hundreds of different circles of varying sizes and dozens of squares, including squares for the French and the Russians and the Spanish and the Dutch, as well as for the various British colonies. I think that sort of map would be far more revealing than the maps we usually find in our textbooks, which show these empires with nice, neat borders in which all of the empires have quickly carved up all of North America. And those images are almost completely fictional. But to just sort of imagine these particular circles as if we could fix at one time one particular map that would reveal all of this complexity, of course, understates things. Because native peoples are themselves constantly shifting as to where they're located, what their identities will be, what they will call themselves, which particular confederations they will live in, which particular chiefdoms will be more powerful. We're becoming vaguely familiar with the kind of cycling of power in the native world pre-contact, in which some particular chiefdoms will surge ahead apparently in power for periods of time and exercise a broad influence, and then they will diminish in power, and some other chiefdom somewhere else on the landscape would surge. So there certainly is a history for native peoples pre-contact, although we don't well understand that history. And again, this goes to Liz Beth's particular explanation about how we are very dependent on the particular archives that we work with. So, but we also need to, I think, also recognize that when colonizers come into this world, that the cycling of peoples and the ebbing and flowing of power becomes accelerated, and that there are certain traumatic introductions to their world, including, of course, disease pathogens, new trade goods, new forms of war, new weapons, all of which native peoples are going to have to come to grips with. And it's going to lead to the particular forms of ethnogenesis that will ultimately lead in the course of the 18th century to the emergence of the Catawba as one people, rather than the cluster of different peoples that they were in 1721. So ultimately, this is not one fixed picture. In a way, this is a kaleidoscope of a world of circles and squares, which is shifting very rapidly through 4 centuries of time. And we can even understand it as operating on different scales, almost like playing chess on 3 different levels, in that there will be the colonial understandings that will vary by empire as to how these networks work, which will be a completely partial understanding. And each native people will have a different understanding of how these networks will have worked and where they should go in the future. So ultimately, I'm trying to imagine this more as a moving picture rather than as a still shot of the native and the colonial worlds. Thank you.